well, this is mitigation planning, should say mitigation planning, has 5 parts. There's an introduction, short one, fundamentals of mitigation planning, where we will look at why are we talking about mitigation planning and what are the key concepts. Then we see some mitigation frameworks and the synergies. So there's different sort of frameworks, of course, we need to take into consideration, NDC, net zero long-term strategies, and so forth. Then we'll have a look at the development of mitigation frameworks. What are the key steps to consider when we develop a mitigation framework, a sound national mitigation framework? And lastly, the 5th point is policy implementation related to mitigation. As you see on this graph, this relates to the introductory presentation and already to the presentation that we heard today. So what we see here is sort of a mapping of the capacity building curriculum that was developed for Trinidad and Tobago, which has been now trained with the trainers as well at the University of the West Indies. And we see the different modules, right? And here in blue, this is the module that is presented now. There's mitigation planning, which closely relates to module A2, which is mitigation. So in this module, mitigation and NDC tracking, the technical backbone, let's say, the main concepts of what is climate change mitigation, so the basic understanding is transported in this module, feeding into this, but rest assured, we will have a look at the key concepts of mitigation, so we will ensure the definitions are clear at the outset of this presentation as well. And then there's a strong need, of course, to align mitigation planning with adaptation planning, leverage synergies, and to see this through this whole decision-making and mainstreaming lens as well. So we'll have a look now at why mitigation planning is relevant, what it is, and how countries develop effective mitigation planning frameworks. And lastly, connected to the agenda point, implementation, what do we need to actually put this into action? To start off with a brief definition, what is mitigation? So mitigation refers to actions taken to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, as well as to enhance natural carbon sinks, the forest resource for instance, or remove carbon dioxide, aiming to mitigate the impacts of climate change and limit global warming. Well, that is mitigation. Mitigation planning then is, or refers to the systematic process of identifying, assessing, and implementing a framework for action to reduce or prevent the emission of GHGs and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So mitigation as a concept, any sort of action or plan to reduce emissions, and mitigation planning is the systematization of this, right? So to putting this into a plan, trying to find a way to put mitigation actions together to have a coherent national plan or sectoral. Why is mitigation important? Why is mitigation planning important? Well, to do what the Paris Agreement sets out to do, right? To limit the worst consequences of global warming, to reduce emissions worldwide, for which efforts by all countries and commitments by all countries are needed. What we see, however, when we have one policy area, there's always intersections with other policy areas. This could be now, we could be talking about transport and industry right now. Now we're talking about mitigation, and we see that there's of course co-benefits, right? And with considerations that we have to keep in mind, right? So sustainable development, innovation, economic growth. We discussed this in the Q&A partially. So mitigation planning of course has an opening and offers opportunities to ensure sustainable development in a country if done right. In order to do this right, we need alignment with national development goals, right? So there's national plans, of course, economic, social, labor, you can name it. So we need to ensure that our mitigation goals, our mitigation planning does not refute those national development goals, and rather to increase the synergies, right? To leverage that. It needs to be socially acceptable. Any policy is only as good as the society that sort of reaps the fruit of that policy, right? So if it's socially unacceptable to implement a certain strategy, we cannot suddenly from today to tomorrow ban all cars. It will reduce emissions. The country will also grind to a halt, so that's not acceptable socially. It should be resource efficient, so to prioritize specific measures or plans over others. and as I mentioned, not refuting other development efforts. So linking this to the national context, the relevance for mitigation planning in the country here in Trinidad and Tobago, it's important because the country does its share, it commits to reduce its emission, and what makes sense, of course, what many countries do, and what Trinidad and Tobago, of course, did as well in its NDC implementation process, or in general in its mitigation planning so far, is that it looks at the sectors where it emits the most emissions, right? Where do we have a lot of emission intensity? You see these small buttons here. There should be the power generation, there should be industry, and there should be transport. So these are the sectors identified as priority in the country for implementing emissions reductions. Then mitigation planning, what we will look at, we will have a deeper look into all of these points going forward in the presentation now. Just in the first step, we need to evaluate the landscape, right? So far we have been mostly talking about NDCs, and that is for a reason, and the reason is that these are the key national planning frameworks for mitigation worldwide. But there's other frameworks and synergies which need to be, of course, considered, because NDCs are not implemented and are not devised in isolation. So we have long-term, low emission development strategies with net zero targets. Many countries, for example, set them up to reach net zero by 2050 or later, or even earlier. We saw the SDGs in the previous presentation, no? Which already gives us, of course, an idea of how it intersects with other development goals. Then we have sectoral frameworks, a transport sector strategy, a tourism strategy. We need to look at regional frameworks, right? Here, CARICOM, for instance. And related climate change frameworks, such as national adaptation plans and so forth, which need to be aligned. So all of this basically is in the first step, in the first phase, we need to look at what sort of strategies and frameworks do we employ, and where can we find mitigation approaches, where can we find potential opportunities for mitigation to then formalize in our key national strategies. And as for the development, I spoke to this point, identify priority sectors, right? It was done. It was done here by means of looking at the inventory, accounting for greenhouse gases, and seeing this is where we have emissions, this is what we can do about it. So we identified these three sectors: industry, power generation, and transport. With increased data quality, with increased methods for accounting, or enhanced methods for accounting, we know in Trinidad and Tobago there's still some data gaps related to agriculture emissions and land use and forestry sector emissions. When these data gaps are closed, when the data is improved and the knowledge is improved on this, they can also be considered, right? Maybe they can also become a priority sector, and probably that will be the way. Based on identifying priority sectors and having looked at these frameworks, we need to look at targets. We need to think about targets. What is a sensible target? And that is a major issue, because we see a lot of NDCs globally, and while it is not the role of the UNFCCC or of any other country to judge other countries' NDC, like in fact this is like purposely something that is not being done at the international level, but what we can see is that oftentimes it is not very clear how the targets were made. So it's important to consider for the targets national resources, feasibility, that it's achievable in a specific time frame, that it is set up using sectoral expertise and stakeholder consultations to be sure that the target is something that actually reflects something that can be done. Then prioritization of PAMs. PAMs, sorry for the acronym, policies and measures, which is a term that can englobe, or that englobes all sorts of mitigation actions. Mitigation action can be a project, installing renewable capacity. It can be a tax incentive for using different fuels. It can be, you name it. It can be any sort of intervention, measure, policy, incentive, insurance, project with the aim to reduce emissions or enhance carbon sinks. So we need to prioritize those PAMs, those policies and measures that help us reduce emissions in the industry or in the transport sector. And we further prioritize them, of course, by using some sort of analysis. We need to see first whether they even have an impact, a good one that's desirable, and we need to see whether it's cost beneficial or whether there's others that are more cost beneficial maybe. And in the last step, implementation of mitigation planning framework, so stakeholder engagement, participation, financing and resource mobilization, and MR, monitoring, reporting, verification, evaluation. So these points, they tie very strongly as well into the previous presentation, right, where we had a deeper look into institutional arrangements, financing, and also the MRV. So this was already mentioned. So identification of frameworks and synergies. We have the NDC, it's the fundament for short to medium term planning. The NDC now is set until 2030. With the next NDC, right, February 2025, the target will be moved as well to 2035. So it will be ongoing, and every 5 years the country will revise its targets. So this will be the backbone for any short or medium term mitigation planning. Then we have the long-term strategies. This is long-term planning, but it's very necessary to link these two, because if we say we want to be net zero by 2040, and the NDC says we want to reduce 15% by 2030, might be an issue, might not be very feasible. So we need to see that our long-term and our medium-term and short-term, of course, as prepared or as put forth by these two key national documents, are in line with each other. And then, as mentioned, looking at the SDGs, sectoral frameworks, regional frameworks, and other, for instance, adaptation or disaster risk reduction, other related climate change frameworks. Without diving too deep now into nationally determined contributions, because we discussed some parts of this already in the morning, what I would like to mention is that, and this was also briefly mentioned by Mr. Kumar Singh, is that NDCs, while they show the main targets, often they're accompanied by implementation plans. And they're more precise. And they are basically what helps countries to implement their NDCs, because they really say, okay, we have a target for the energy sector, fine. But now, the NDC implementation plans, what they do, they devise actors, responsible actors. They give a time horizon for specific actions, and they really state the objective for each of the actions that will contribute to achieving the NDC. So, if it wasn't the case, if it wouldn't exist in Trinidad and Tobago, my recommendation now would be very strongly to develop such a plan, but it already exists, which is a very good thing. However, as the NDC evolves and as the ambition evolves, the NDC implementation plans should also be revised, of course, right? They should adapt to the NDC that is currently in effect. Looking at the targets of the country, some of you might be aware of this, of course, is that Trinidad and Tobago by 2030, this is as of now, wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to a business as usual scenario, which means the level of emissions we would have if we did nothing by 2030 across the power generation, transport, industry sector, right? So the country develops, there's projections of economic, population growth, and so forth. Using that modeling approach, we modeled, or you modeled in this case, the emissions that you would have by 2030, but now the target is 15% less than what we estimated where we would arrive at, right? And this is accompanied by another goal, by another target, which is a 30% reduction in the public transportation sector emissions by 2030 compared to the same scenario. These two terms are relevant because they're closely linked to the principles of the UNFCCC, right? Common differential responsibility and climate finance, because we have conditional targets and unconditional targets. What conditional means is that this target, Trinidad and Tobago pledges to reduce 15% compared to its business as usual scenario in these three sectors, if it is to receive international financial support. This target, a reduction in the public transportation sector, 30%, is unconditional. So Trinidad and Tobago says, we will fund this from our own resources. Looking then at the NDC implementation plan, it reflects, of course, the three sectors that were identified as priority, and in total, 94 mitigation policies and measures are identified across these three sectors, right? What has happened under the CBIT project and over the past 2 years is that from this NDC implementation plan, us, and in collaboration with all of the stakeholders and various workshops with the EMA and the Ministry of Planning and Development, we've come up with a shorter set of indicators, 18, that are able to track progress on these 94 measures. And by tracking progress, we're able to track progress on the NDC, right? So the logic is these are specific key activities proposed to achieve the targets. So if we now ask stakeholders to track 94 different activities, some are very specific, this might become a data mess. This might become a data mess, it might become fuzzy to link a specific activity to this specific action and this observation to this action. So what has been done is to streamline this in 18 indicators that can be tracked through the national transparency system. Okay. Then moving from NDCs to a second point, which is the long-term low emission development strategies. We have that often develop net zero targets. It's sort of a reverse pathway, right? So we want, where an NDC says we want to achieve this target and then we find the way, this sort of says it starts from 2050 and then we determine all the decisions and investment that we need to get to that target, right? And here you see sort of the interaction between NDCs and long-term strategies when they're supposed to be updated and revised. So this is an indicative roadmap, basically, how these two documents interact, and how here you see every 5 years as well the NDCs ratcheting up the ambition every 5 years as well, are progressing over time, and how this interacts with the long-term emission strategies. Key again to take away is that these two need to be closely interlinked. We can only have net zero or long-term low emission development strategies if we link those to the NDCs, or to our 5-year plans, so to speak. Right. Okay, then to the next point, SDGs. I believe the introduction in the first presentation was more than sufficient on SDGs and what they are. But of course, keep in mind, the SDGs are a way of defining a common language as well across countries of how do we address sustainability goals in the world. So if we implement mitigation action, which is of course closely to climate change, we might also have intersections with other SDGs. And by showing this transparently, we of course generate a good idea of how our policy that we're implementing is linking to wider international development targets. Then this is key, because now we look back at the national level and we look at sectors, at different sectors. And we know policy making in all countries is stratified in economic sectors and areas, right? So the Ministry of Transport, Planning Development, Energy, and so forth. For a reason, of course, because these ministries, they compile expertise in the sectors, people are hired, so as to devise the best plans for each sector. Now when we talk about mitigation, we always move in a sphere of cross-cutting issues, right? We have mitigation in this sector, but it probably has repercussions in other sectors. So we need to get really an idea of how these sectors interact and how policies in these sectors would reflect on the overall mitigation targets, on the overall emission reduction possibilities and targets that we have. So not all policy is, of course, climate change policy, right? We have industry policies, which are for the economic growth of the industry, or which are to improve labor conditions in the industry, for instance. So we need to look for each of the sectors, of course, that we have. These are just some examples. We need to see what sort of directives, policies, regulations do we have, and how would they interact with our mitigation targets and with our mitigation framework, right? Or can we maybe bandwagon, can we find some of those policies that already exist, use that, leverage that, and add some sort of mitigation perspective to it, some climate change, mainstream it basically into it, right? So to find a way to get a good grip on the sectoral landscape in a country and find the best mitigation possibilities and link it back to the main targets that we have. Leaving the national scale, regional and other climate change frameworks should be also considered. So we talked about, I briefly mentioned CARICOM. CARICOM, of course, is an intergovernmental organization. Trinidad and Tobago is a member and receives support already, no? To transform the energy landscape through increasing renewable energy sources and energy efficiencies and conservation. And under the CARICOM, there's the 5C, so the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which helps to mainstream climate change strategies into sustainable development agendas. So it's important that national mitigation plans and strategies also look to the regional sphere. Maybe there's support that can be garnered from the CARICOM or from other regional frameworks. Maybe there's lessons learned, right? Or maybe there's best practices we can observe in other countries that can help us refine and improve our national frameworks. So that's the last point of these different frameworks and strategies we need to look at to find synergies, right? So with adaptation, we'll hear about that in the next presentation, as well about disaster risk reduction, which basically is to make sure that we do not forget about the links. So we devise a policy, a renewable energy policy, and I mean Trinidad and Tobago maybe might not be the best case, but let's use hydropower. Okay, we have a big river in a country that traverses the whole country, and now we build a dam to generate clean energy. Fair enough. We reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, reduce our emissions. So this damming project might have consequences, of course, on the riverine systems, on fisheries, on fish movement, on villages that are located next to the river. So there might be problems, for instance, like also issues with water shortages suddenly because the water is stored in a dam. So this would then interact with adaptation because the affected populations and settlements and the natural environment would have or would observe a reduced resilience or would observe issues that make it more vulnerable to impacts of climate change, of course, right? So we must not forget about that when we devise these policies for climate change specifically, we need to look at specific other policies as well and other policy areas such as adaptation or disaster risk reduction. Okay, so then let's move to the second to last part, development of a mitigation framework, and here we see some steps. So afterwards we will look at implementation, but for the evaluation planning, so identify key sectors, set targets, I mentioned this before, prioritize mitigation actions to reach the targets based on impact and feasibility, and integrate mitigation planning with other national development goals and strategies, right? And drafting a sound implementation plan. So to basically formalize this in a good way. For priority sectors, now we take a very brief detour into methodologies for greenhouse gas accounting. This is just, of course, we can take it already from the point that we consider we have this. We have very good knowledge about where we have emissions. And when we have that, what we do in these greenhouse gas inventories, which are also reported every 2 years, we identify key categories. Those are the categories which together represent 95% or more of the national total of emissions. In many countries, it's not more than 10 or even 7. Like, it can be less. Like, it can be that a few categories, we talked about Guyana, for instance, they have 2 major categories, of course. They have oil and gas, they have fugitive emissions from oil and gas, and they have the forestry sector, right? So this is carbon sequestration. So those are key categories. So a country like Guyana would then focus, of course, their efforts in mitigation on these sectors that have the most impact on the inventory, right? And similar for Trinidad and Tobago. This is why the sectors, for now, power generation, industry, and transport were chosen. Then when we look at the sectors, we also need to look ahead. So this is just an example. Imagine the country would not have any of these resources, right? Could have chosen a different one maybe, but we recently discovered natural gas. So we know we will also use this to ramp up the chemical industry, produce ammonia. Or we know we want to use, because we have a lot of land that is unused and there's no settlements, we want to use it for cattle farming and make some money off of the beef. Okay. But all these plans, all these ideas that we have for our sectors, our prioritization of sectors which might go beyond climate change, go beyond like key categories, because this is reactive to what we observe. We should be proactive in knowing what activities we may be starting, we may be commencing, which will have an impact on our emissions, right? So we need to take that into consideration. And as well, cross-sectoral effects. That was the example that I mentioned with the hydropower, right? renewable energy sector, we need to check, are there potential labor market improvements, technological advancement? If we pour money into the sector, is it likely that the skill, the capacity, and the resources will remain in that sector, or will it be bought up? So all of this should, of course, be feeding the identification of priority sectors to kind of say, okay, this is where I will focus my resources to reduce emissions. This just shows what I just explained. So key categories, future development trajectories, and policy options for potential co-benefits. Looking at targets, probably there's no need to read this all out, but what should targets be like and what should they not be like? Targets should not be, of course, disconnected from national context. They should not be unfeasible. They should not be impossible, of course. So they should be based on a well-developed greenhouse gas inventory. I cannot repeat that often enough, because that's really the basis. For sound mitigation policy, we need to know where do we have emissions. Without that, it becomes sort of arbitrary. Then it needs to be reflective of national development trajectories, right? There was this point as well. We know, okay, suddenly we discover natural gas. This will set us on a new trajectory, probably. Should be ambitious. This is Paris Agreement, right? We should be ambitious about it, every 5 years more. And should be politically, we could add socially achievable, right? So if we set targets where we know we will not get support by the society or by politics, basically because it's just not feasible. Again, an example, taking cars off the road, like halving the cars, is not going to be achievable, even though it might be ambitious, might not be reflective, but even though it might help to reduce emissions by a lot, this is where it breaks. So we need to consider this as well. Just to elaborate briefly a bit more on that, to prioritize mitigation policies and measures, these are 3 points we can look at: relevance, feasibility, and adequacy. Relevance is the impact is significant enough, right? We need estimations for that. There's ways to estimate. We will not go in depth into this, but there's ways to estimate, of course, a priori before implementation, what the likely impact on emissions will be of a specific policy. If we deem it as relevant, we have to look at feasibility, of course. Do we have the resources, technological readiness levels, right? The capacities, political societal support. Adequacy, this is the degree of confidence that policymakers or decision makers and experts have regarding the economic, political, and social agreeability, specific policy or measure. Maybe we have, or let's use the example by my colleague from Canada. So they said it's relevant to close down our gas industry and oil in Alberta. It's feasible to close it down, okay? Societal support might be a bit problematic, but then is it adequate? Is it adequate? Probably it was not the choice that was made, but it's likely that this is where it breaks, because when it's really not socially acceptable, when there's really too many negative consequences of a specific mitigation policy, it should not be considered, should not be prioritized, let's say. Considered, yes. Brief example, we have different options for renewables, right? Wind power, solar power, hydropower. We look at Trinidad and Tobago. Renewable energy, as of yet, doesn't play a major role yet. The biggest share of renewables is bioenergy, which can be transported to combustion sites, but there's a lot and a growing, there's potential and a growing market for solar PV, no, for photovoltaics in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have areas, there's maps that can be accessed online, and of course experts have access to even better maps that show how much the potential is in specific areas in the country. And then we see that wind power and hydropower do not play a major role yet. Hydropower, we don't have these very strong riverine systems in the country, and wind power, the potential is not as good as solar power. So when we set out on a renewable energy trajectory, we might want to prioritize solar PV over these other choices, right? So this is just a very easy example to how we should think when we prioritize mitigation policies. And linked to that, of course, very much as well to feasibility, cost benefit. what should feed a cost-benefit analysis is, of course, expected costs, realized costs. What are the social costs? Are there any gains to be made from because we're being innovative? Are there any further gains to be expected because we have our technology that's being developed further than it was so far? And how this CBA is done, cost-benefit analysis, depends on a specific sector or a country, of course. But the idea is, of course, that mitigation policies should undergo some sort of analysis to know whether we should reconsider or pursue it. So to end this short part, when we've done all this, we arrive at a list of prioritized policies and measures for mitigation, which are addressing greenhouse gas emissions in priority sectors, are aligned with the overall targets, are relevant, are feasible, are adequate, and are cost beneficial. Okay, so this is a bit small, but what I just want to show with this arguably big graph here, or big image, is that when we align with other frameworks and strategies, once we have targets, once we have the sectors, we have the targets, we have the policies, we need to integrate. Because we've done this in the beginning, we evaluated all the frameworks out there and strategies, and now we need to link this again back to ensure that we horizontally integrate, horizontally being between sectors, for instance, that we vertically integrate, that we make a distinction between what is to be done on a regional level, on a local level, or on the national level, that we're consistent with our national key strategies, the NDC and the long-term low emission development strategy on net zero, and that we consider wider reaching cross-sectional policy implications for SDGs or for other areas such as disaster risk reduction adaptation. So this just tries to englobe that we ensure that our mitigation policies are well integrated with the wider nexus. So when it gets to these implementation plans, this is what countries need to do, right? Like again, this will be my recommendation, do an NDC implementation plan, it already exists. In most countries, this is the most developed, so the most apt document, national document, to sort of formalize a sound mitigation framework. But we should consider this as a living document and also not maybe in isolation, because we should never forget about other sector development strategies, so this should be always updated as required, and we should also never forget about the long-term targets that we have. So how do we implement this? 3 points: stakeholder engagement and participation, financing and resource mobilization, and MRV. And I believe the first presentation was way more exhaustive on this, so let's not dwell on this too much. It's just, we of course need to consider various stakeholder groups, ensure involvement by as many different sectors and stakeholders as possible, engage them for data, engage them for ideas, and to check what is feasible and what is adequate, we also need to engage with them, of course. Then when we see financing and resources, mobilization, we have different sorts of financial streams we can tap into, we can consider. Domestic budgets is the first thing that comes to mind, of course. The national climate finance mechanisms, so this project, for instance, is part of one of those mechanisms, right? So we could call this capacity building because, this is climate finance basically, because it's the Global Environmental Facility funding a project for climate change transparency. Then private sector investments, very important, often the potentially biggest source of income, private sector, of course, and innovative financing instruments, also public and private sector collaborations, and so forth. So there's really a big landscape on different sources of funding, and then there's different types. We can have grants, loans, private investments. Again, there's a debate, of course, whether a loan really is climate finance. But if we try to look beyond that and we just want to say that we want to implement our strategy, maybe a loan is still a good way, right? We take a loan, maybe a concessional one with better than market rates from a development bank, and we develop this certain project because it will help us address our mitigation targets. This is taken from the NDC investment planning from basically from an official website about resource mobilization. It basically showcases what was mentioned. So stage 1, investment planning, the arrangements, stakeholder engagement, monitoring. Stage 2, identifying the NDC investment needs. We know Trinidad and Tobago. Maybe the costing has changed, maybe there's better estimates available by now. The current NDC implementation plan sets the cost to achieve the targets that we talked about at around $2 billion US, with most of it being conditioned upon receipt of international support. So this is part of this, identifying the investment needs and costing. Then a gap analysis. How much of this costing can we mobilize? Is there a gap? Do we need to change our mobilization strategies? Then which investments to prioritize? Grants over loans, private sector involvement, how much can we garner? And then to mobilize this, right? So, and this is really reduce the barriers for investments, match sources of financing to specific projects, prepare the projects in a sound way. So the more or the clearer a specific project is formulated, the clearer it is made how this project will reduce emissions and how much, the easier it will be to link specific financial resources to this, to first cost it, and then to link adequate funding streams to the action. And the last part is then monitoring and reporting. So again, start with a high-level template for mitigation planning, right? NDCs, NDC implementation plans, any support documents we might need, establish monitoring mechanisms, evaluate progress. This is done through the indicators in this case, and you see this as an iterative process. And to do this process, basically, this whole monitoring, reporting, evaluation process, the NTS collaborates already, and this will intensify with a range of stakeholders as required to ensure adequate progress tracking and to improve the processes. And then this, of course, goes again beyond maybe even the NTS, even though it is the main national body for reporting, of course. This is to be taken within your organizations, back to your organizations within the ministries, to kind of have this in your mind when certain policies are being made, when you're involved, or when you hear about certain things, to not forget about, okay, is there a chance for emissions reductions? Is this emission reduction feasible? Is it attainable? Is it feasible? Is it adequate to do it? What is a good target? How can we space this project, and so forth? So there's a lot of considerations that should feed a mitigation planning process.